like to thank you all for coming for this. It's going to be an extremely interesting lecture on gems, something we don't really have that much, by our Polish friend and colleague, Paweł Gołyźniak, and now, wonderful. So this will now test me and my Polish. But leaving that aside, he works as a research fellow in the Institute of Archaeology in Krakow. He's published the Catalogue and Study of Ancient Engraved Gems collection from the National Museum in Krakow. In fact, I will come to this. Accomplished the study of another Polish family collection, which I will not pronounce, and he will then tell you more about, because then Elena will have a fit. And this collection has cylinder seals, intaglios, cameos, and amulets. And this is in press, as well as many articles in the field. And this is something at an incredibly young age. He has really achieved, he's become a great authority in this field of gems. And we're extremely pleased that he's come here to the American Numismatics Society to also look at our gems and some of our holdings. His research interests, though, include also, apart from these engraved gems, and here he doesn't look just at ancient but also at neoclassical gems. He looks at Roman, Republican and Augustan numismatics, history of antiquarianism, collecting and scholarship, as well as 18th century drawings of intaglios and cameos, and the legacy of antiquary and connoisseur Philipp von Stosch. Really easy. And with these words, I just want to say that anyone who's interested in publishing at a very steep discount his most recent book that the ANS helped fund, it is here, and I believe the price is $25 at a normal 175 euros. So this is the bargain if you want one. But I will now hand over to Paweł. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here and to speak in front of such a wonderful audience about engraved gems, of course. So first of all, I would like to thank Ute for her kind invitation, and also to thank Jonathan for the outstanding hospitality while I'm here in New York studying gems from the INS collection. And yes, so while we were discussing the subject of this presentation, we thought that it might be a good idea to produce a sort of introduction to the gems world for you. And so you will hear in the first part of this presentation about engraved gems, what they are, and an overview of engraved gems in antiquity will be presented to you too. And then we will turn into the subject of gems and coins relationships. So I would like to approach this issue at 3 levels, let's say, whether there are some technical similarities, content similarities, and finally functional similarities. So have you ever heard about engraved gems? So this is the first question, right? A couple of people I see know it, so yeah, so you've heard about this. So anybody recognizes this one? Of course, right? So this is the Great Cameo of France, a masterpiece of Roman Imperial glyptics dated to the second quarter of the 1st century AD. It basically represents Julio-Claudian family, right? And it was probably carved because of the adoption of Tiberius' sons, and it celebrated that event. And you can see there is a Tiberius in the center, sitting on a throne, and there is Augustus in the upper register over here. And of course the barbarians defeated by the Romans in the lower register too. But so as you can see, there is an immense information in one piece only. But what is interesting about engraved gems, and specifically about this one, is that they carry a lot of history with them too, because the Great Cameo of France was carved in Rome itself, right? But then it turned to it traveled to Constantinople while it became a capital city of the Roman Empire. And then the emperor of the Latin Empire in 30th century, Baldwin II, sold the cameo to the French king Louis VI. So it traveled back to the Western Europe, to France. And when the French kings were in the need, they just passed it to the Pope Clement VI, and they reclaimed it in the 14th century. And what is interesting that this gem specifically was reinterpreted during the medieval period. It was thought to represent the triumph of Josephus at the Pharaoh court. So you can see that depending on the period, gems could be interpreted in a very different way. Then it was twice stolen in 1804 and in 1912, so it lost its original setting, but it survived and is presented right now in the Cabinet des Médailles in Paris, where you can admire it. But so this actually tells us also another interesting thing about engraved gems, because they were extremely popular since the Renaissance times until the 19th century as collectibles. So they were collected by many, by the kings, by emperors, by aristocrats. And actually this collecting thing happened already in antiquity. So do you recognize this person? Right, the Mithridates VI, Sopater, right? And here is Julius Caesar. So the connection between these two is that they were both collectors of gems, actually, which is scarcely known. And here we have two people from the modern era. The last king of Poland, Stanisław August Poniatowski, who collected almost 400 of gems. And Catherine the Great, who was crazy about gems. She collected thousands of them, actually. And gems were very inspirational to the modern artists as well, right? Here you can see Peter Paul Rubens' work, the painting of the great inspired by the great cameo of France, of course. And the painting hangs right now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. But also, people like Sigmund Freud also collected gems and were inspired by them. So you can see collecting was a very important part of the gem world. And the third thing related to gems is they contributed a lot to the development of archaeology as a scientific discipline. And here you can see Philipp von Stosch, and he contributed with a very important publication in 1724. He published a book about signet gems and ancient signet gems, and this was a landmark because he was followed by Johann Joachim Winckelmann, and Winckelmann catalogued Stosch collection in 1760. But as you can see, it is not a coincidence that the best gem from the Stosch collection appeared at the frontispiece of the most important work of Winckelmann, right, the Geschichte der Kunst des Altertums. Now here you can see another great figure related to engraved gems world, Adolf Furtwängler, who was called Linnaeus of archaeology, right? Because he amassed vast amounts of material, including engraved gems. He studied them carefully and classified, put into their chronological order. And even though his book, published in 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, is still valid today. So. And here you can see an example of a scholar, Sir John Boardman, who also studies gems. So there are not many scholars actually studying gems, but some of them do, and they do this really well. So what are engraved gems? So glyptics, generally speaking, is an art of engraving precious and semi-precious stones with small images. Gem is a precious stone which is given that image, and it is carved into its into stone's surface. Then we are calling it an intaglio, and when the gem is decorated in relief, we call it cameo. And gem engraver is an artist who produced engraved gems. So here you can see an overview of sort of types of gemstones which were used in antiquity. This is just to show you how diverse this art is, and starting from the material itself. And of course other materials than hard stones were used in antiquity, like slate, gold, silver, bronze, and glass was really important, especially in the Hellenistic and Roman Republican periods. And coral and bone are were less popular. And we used to refer to moxke in terms of distinguishing gems between themselves, how hard they were, and difficult to engrave in. Here you can see a map that illustrates where the gems were supplied to the Mediterranean world. So basically, India and Sri Lanka, like today, was the most important region where the gems came from. And another really important region was Anatolia, and in Egypt there were also some sources for engraved stones, but some specific stones were really popular everywhere, like agate, for instance, was abundant in Sicily, but some were not that popular, like lapis lazuli, which was almost exclusively connected to Afghanistan in antiquity. So some of them were really rare, and that helps us to understand the trade routes, how they functioned in terms of gems. You might wonder how the production process looked like. So basically we think that there were two types of craftsmen producing engraved gems. So the first type focused on preparations of the rough material, right, the stone itself. And then another artist came in with an idea of its decoration, and he executed it. But generally speaking, the process can be described like stone rough stone preparation, then it was shaped, then the concept must have been born and visualized somehow on the stone itself. The artist made a preparatory sketch and cut the major parts of the depiction, and then he added some detailing and polished everything, and the gem could be set into a mount. We can reconstruct these ancient techniques based on both ancient and modern sources. The earliest engraved gems were cut in the late Neolithic period, actually, with hand, with simple flint, obsidian, or copper tools, mainly chisels. But around the mid of the 4th millennium BC in Mesopotamia's Intaglios, engravers started to engrave them with hardened bronze cutting wheels and pointed drills, and they started to use the combination of oil and emery powders. That helps them to work with much harder materials. And around the 5th century BC, the Greeks invented the diamond-tipped drill, and its introduction actually allowed them to do much more with the stones. Here you can see on the top the reconstruction of a bow drill, which was used in antiquity. Basically, it functioned like a saw while we are cutting wood, right? So that the drill could rotate and cut the gem. And here, and here you can see a drawing reconstructing a sort of tomb decoration where the bow drill is in action, and here you can see the bow drill, of course, in the top of this fragment of a tombstone of gem engraver Doros from Sardes. We can see that from modern sources that tools didn't change that much over this past, let's say, 2000s of years. The same drills were used, but the only new thing is electricity, which drives drills right now. Gems were mounted in various objects, right? But mainly they were mounted in rings. They were used as ringstones, but they also were set in necklaces, brooches, bracelets, earrings, you name it. So, there are basically three most important functions attached to engraved gems. They were used as seals. They were invented before the actual writing system was invented. So there was a need for authorization and secure of various documents, letters, correspondence, trade contracts, whatever, right? So they were sort of signatures for the ancient people. These seals were used so that the image could be impressed on a wet clay, and here you have two examples of the cylinder seals which were used in Near East in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC. These cylinder seals were used on clay tablets, but of course some of them were also used to produce sealings themselves in other forms. So, but what we can actually learn from engraved gemstones, this is rather interesting because there is a lot of information which we can get from them. So they are useful for dating sometimes, for archaeological layers when they are found them at the archaeological excavations. But the rich iconography and inscriptions are really perfect literary and iconographical sources to reconstruct the past. Information can be obtained about local administration and state government, about relationships between people, about the ancient economy, especially trade, about religious practices, rituals, magics in daily life, architecture, means of transport, fashion, you name it, everything is over there, believe me, on engraved gems. So cylinder seals were a dominant form of engraved gems in the Near East in antiquity. But in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, this form took a scarab. So the scarabs could be also seals, of course, right? But some of them also, for instance, like this example here from the British Museum, commemorated successes in hunting for white bulls of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. So gems could commemorate important events. They were used for propaganda purposes, but they reflect, this is probably the most important thing, they reflect personal tastes and preferences. They expressed a sort of self-presentation. People used to manifest their beliefs, religion, philosophy, or political affinity. And they were important family heirlooms because we have evidence that they were passed from one generation to another. So I mentioned that the seals was the primary function for gems, of course, right? But many of them were used also as amulets to protect people, their owners, to ensure with blessings of various deities. So they were used as amulets, but they also testify to crossing of cultural borders. Like the form of the scarab, so popular in Egypt, actually was adopted by the Phoenicians. Here you can see the Phoenician scarab. And that scarab form was then adopted by the Etruscans and even the Greeks in the 6th century BC, carved the gems in the form of a scarab. Gems were used, of course, for decoration, for personal adornment, as jewelry pieces and showpieces. The best of them were carved by masters who, at the point of, let's say, 5th century BC in Greece, started to put their signatures. So that employment of a gem, because employment of gem engravers showed the special social status of the person who decided to have such a gem carved. And it was a confirmation of its wealth because they were extremely costly products of antiquity. So here you can see two examples of scaraboids, because in the 5th century BC, the Greeks started to simplify the scarab form so that the back of the gem was flat rather than in the form of a scarab, and they are carved with beautiful images, of course. At the point of Hellenistic age, gems started to be carved. I mean, new form was born, like the cameo. The cameos were products of luxury, of course, and not many could afford them. Mainly, probably the royal families. And here you can see two examples. Stating to that, and including the famous tazza farnese. So gems could be also engraved in the form of cameos, but also in cameo vessels, we call them. But at the point of Hellenistic times, we observed that gems started to be more and more politically significant. So that we have evidence from the literary sources that, for instance, Pergoteles was the only one engraver of gems who could cut portraits of Alexander the Great. And also we find in literary sources evidence that specific gems were used, especially those with portraits, to express political affinity to one party or another. So this was important, and this is even more important when we are speaking about the Roman culture. For the Romans, the most important form of gemstones were ringstones, intaglios, set into the rings, like here. And in the 1st century BC, very popular became gems made of glass. They were made out of matrices prepared beforehand, so that they were molded. And because they were relatively cheap, and at the point of 1st century BC, Rome was crazy about gems, and everybody wanted to have one. So that the artists started to produce cheaper, gems executed in cheaper materials, like glass, that imitated the actual gemstones. But we can find evidence also that gems were important social status makers. Like a good case is that of Marius, because he appeared during his triumph with a gold ring engraved with a gem, whereas he's supposed to appear with an simple iron ring to show his modesty and pietas. That backfired actually him. But we also hear that Lucullus, while he was visiting the Ptolemaic court, he received a gold ring with a portrait engraved upon it of the Ptolemy the nymph, and he had to accept this ring. So gems were also exchanged as diplomatic gifts. And at the point when gems became really important for the Romans, when Pompey the Great came back from his campaign from East, and he brought the Dactylotheca, which is the word for collection of gems in antiquity, that one of King Mithridates VI Eupator, and he consecrated that collection to the temple of Jupiter at the Capitoline Hill. Gems became really important, and especially the cameos during the Augustus times when they commemorated important events. And here you have an example from the Metropolitan Museum here from New York. And of course, gems continued to be produced in the Roman Imperial period. And this is interesting photograph of gems which were found in Bath, in England, at the drainage pipes, because people used to go to bath themselves with their rings on their fingers, and sometimes they slept off their fingers, and sometimes the gem themselves just fell apart from the finger ring and were lost in the drainage. And the archaeologists, while they was doing the field work, they found 88 gems at the end of one of the pipes collected from them. So that's amazing, actually. But some of the gems were also given a sort of form of statuettes, like these two examples here, one from the Getty, the second from the Princeton University Art Museum. These one were used for private cults, but they were extremely expensive items, for sure. In the Roman Imperial period, magical gems and amulets became really popular too. And they were used for curative and protective purposes, as I said before, like this gem with Knubis was supposed to help with some digestive problems and with the stomach in general. Whereas here we have a sort of combination that stands for three gods, actually. We have cockerel's legs over here, that refers to Mercury, and I mean, this refers to the cockerel itself, of course, but he was a sacred bird of Mercury. We have a Silenus mask over here, and elephant's head with tusk and trump holding a palm branch, which represents Bacchus' Indian triumph, of course. And the whole creature looks like a peacock that was a sacred bird to goddess Juno. So the owner had protection and blessing from three gods in one, actually, like here. And during the late antique times, like in the 3rd century AD, unfortunately, gems started to fade away because they were luxury products, and because the economy mostly collapsed, the gems started to be less and less popular. Of course, some of them, I mean, the masterpieces were created at the court of the Roman emperors, but casual gems were also engraved, sometimes with wonderful messages. Like here is the inscription surrounding that hand pinching the ear, which we can read like, "Remember me and my good soul, you're the sweetheart." So this is a beautiful message from somebody who actually passed away to the person who left him. But gems are simplified, and the last category of gems which we can somehow connect to antiquity are early Christian gems. They were obviously furnished with scenes from the Bible and also the symbolism of Christianity. And this is a sort of overview of engraved gems in antiquity. Very brief one, but we are turning to the second part of this lecture, which are gems and coins relationships. And first, I would like to consider the technical similarities. So it might look like gems, really small objects, are comparable to coins, which are also really small, and they share their shapes. Also, because they are circular or oval shape mostly. But when we start to investigate this issue deeper, it turns out that we might see the problems, because the engraving process itself might have looked the same in case of engraved gems and coins. As it was explained, we can imagine that when production of coins was started to be when the coin was produced, there was the same process. Like there was a rough material preparation, right? The piece of metal must have been first prepared, and then there was a visualization of what is going to be put on that coin, and so on. So we can see similarities gems too. But the question is whether the same repertoire of tools was used for both gems and coins. So not really, because coin dies can be prepared with chisels, because metal is much softer than the hard stones mostly. But the hard stones for engraving, the hard stones required much completely different set of tools. However, there is a bridge between gems and coins, which are engraved finger rings. They were made of gold and silver and bronze, so the same material as the coins were actually. So there is a bridge, but the problem is that finger rings were popular during the Hellenistic, Greco-classical period and Hellenistic period, but they stopped to be so popular during the Roman period. There are not many examples of gold rings or silver rings engraved in the Roman times with portraits or other scenes. So the question is whether a gem engraver could easily learn how to cut coin dies and vice versa. We suppose that it was not that super difficult for a gem engraver to cut coin die, for instance, too, because when he was trained and had skills enough to produce something in hard stone, it was much easier for him to cut simply in metal. But the other way around might have been a little bit more difficult. But the ultimate goal was to create actually a negative form later used to make a positive one. In case of gems, it was an impression, usually. In case of coin die, a coin. But the problem is that many gems actually were not used for sealings, especially in the Roman times, because they functioned as amulets. So they were used not actually in a negative form rather than a positive one. Coin dice makers, there is another question for the sort of technical similarities, is whether the coin die makers frequently traveled, and examples are, for instance, the Winetos, who worked in several places on Sicily, and later also Procles, who started to work in Catania, and also we found his works on Naxos. So it is generally believed that gem engravers were also quite mobile. And that's actually probably they were even more mobile than coin die makers were, because when we imagine how coins were produced, they must have been set in one place under authority of a specific person, usually king or emperor. But gems, of course, they were also made on the commission. Usually a private one. Of course, some workshops, this will be discussed later, but some workshops functioned at the Roman Imperial court. But generally speaking, the commission itself is a private commission, was still in its nature like a commission of coins, right? So somebody wanted a specific design to be carved on a gemstone, on its private seal. So we can imagine that actually there is a similarity between these two at this issue. So and we have an examples that coin dice makers traveled, and of course gem makers also traveled a lot. Especially in the 1st century BC, we observed that a lot of Greek gem engravers transferred their businesses back to the western part of the Mediterranean basin, because they sought for new markets where they could produce and sell their products. Now, the question of style is of course very difficult to answer, but even when we have we can find examples of the same design produced on gems and coins or finger rings. Still, the style sometimes is not distinctive enough, or it is completely different. So that means we cannot say that even the design is the same handwork on both products. But we can point to at least 2 examples when it is quite probable that both gems and coins were produced by the same artist. And an example of this is Phrygilos, who worked on tetragramm of Syracuse and later also on the silver statue of Tauroi. And we find 2 gems signed by some Phrygilos too. And when we start to compare the style, for instance, of the elegant face of Eros with the face of the Sugad and Athena, so we start to believe that slowly he might have produced actually both gems and coins alike. And comparing the fleshy muscles of this bull with the body of Heracles over here, when the emphasis is put on the muscles very clearly too, this makes this starts to make sense. However, we must be very careful when we compare gems and coins in this term, because here is another example. There is a coin of Arcadian League starter, which is signed over here. I mean, there is a name which we read as Olympus, and there is a gem engraver who signed it himself as Olympus as well here. So the question is whether this could be the same person, but the problem is that actually the name appearing on the coin might refer to the administrator of the mint actually, so he doesn't have to be necessarily the name of the actual engraver. So in this case, these two signatures might be totally coincidental, close. But in the Hellenistic period, we have informations in the literary sources. We find them that gem engravers worked on royal commissions, and here is an example of Nicandros who cut gems with portraits of Ptolemaic kings and queens. And when we carefully study the style of these portraits, we found them strikingly close to those produced on actual coins of the Ptolemaic rulers. And here is an example from the Roman Republic where you can see actually this is the glass gem. The glass gem which was produced directly after the coin itself, right? It was a replica of a coin, and we can assume that actually the matrix itself could be prepared by the same artist who was responsible for coin production. Yeah, so going further to the content similarities, of course, as you can already seen, sometimes gems and coins share their iconography, and this might be for several reasons. So gem engravers copied devices from coins because they were easily accessible, so this might be the first case. There is an interesting theory drew by Enid Hamburger and Martin Henning that there were book patterns circulating around the Mediterranean world, so that the artist could take inspiration from one source. And of course, sometimes the similarities in terms of content appearing on both gems and coins can be totally coincidental because the source of inspiration was the same, right? A cult statue or a painting could serve as a source of inspiration for both artists. So when we find the same design on gems and coins, it doesn't automatically mean that the same person, of course, made it. But the real question is, were gem engravers freer of choice of the devices they used to put on the gems, or did they actually work strictly according to the commission they have to execute like coin die makers? As I said before, usually gem engravers worked strictly on a commission, a private one, because somebody wanted something specific for its seal, for his seal. But we can imagine that the market also worked in a slightly different way, so that the gem engravers could produce some amount of gems just for a general public, like amulets, for instance, right? And then they were freer of choice rather than coin die makers. But we can find examples, especially if glass gems are concerned, that the design is directly copied from coins themselves. Like here, even the signature is copied. In this case, and here is another interesting example when we can find coins are extremely helpful to identify persons that are depicted on gems, and here might be the case where Titus Quinticus Flaminius is represented on the gem signed by Daedalus, a Greek engraver. And it is interesting to see that during the 2nd century BC, more and more Romans traveling to the eastern part of the Mediterranean world start to produce gems. They start to commission gems with their own portraits, because it was unpopular in the western part of Mediterranean, in Rome itself. But they start to follow their Hellenistic counterparts and put their own portraits on gems. So this is an example also quite illustrating the fact that sometimes gems and coins share the content in terms of the same sort of propaganda actions. Like, we know for the fact that coin dye makers, or the commissioners, used to advertise their family stories on coins, especially during the end of the 2nd century BC and the first half of the 1st century BC. And we find similar designs on gems too, which might indicate that some members of these families used to have the seals that represented the same things as the coins did. But we must be careful again, because in terms of coins we are in a better position, since we can relate somehow the pictures they depict to the persons because there are inscriptions, and usually, not always, but many times we know who actually was responsible for specific coin production. Like in this case, Ulysses appears on this coin because it was a symbol of Mammalia family, who descended from Mammalia, who was daughter of Telegonus, and Telegonus was son of Ulysses himself. And when we have almost exactly the same depiction on a gem, of course we can suppose that that the gem served as a seal of a member of Mammalia family. But on the other hand, there are multiple other explanations for gems, which make them difficult to study, but much more enjoyable, because you have many other options. So in this case, actually, that Ulysses might represent persistence. Of course, he was a perfect choice for a seal because of the secrecy surrounding his personality, and since seals were supposed to also keep secrecy to the documents they were used on, he makes a perfect choice for a seal. But he was also a patron to at least 10 cities in central and southern Italy. So he might have served as a local authority or something like that. In terms of portraits, of course, portraits again in the Roman period, they are represented on both gems and coins alike. And we can see that they were used for the same reasons, actually, to advertise political leaders. And we hear from the literary sources that actually followers of these political leaders used to have rings with gems engraved with portraits of their leaders. And in this case, this is the famous gem representing Sixtus Pompeius, we suppose, from Antikensammlung in Berlin. And we hear from Florus that followers of Sextus, after the loss of Battle of Naulochus, used to throw away their rings with his portraits to be not recognized as his followers anymore. And here you have just a few more examples of the same designs of coins. And coins help us to date gems, of course, right? Because coins are much more much less difficult to date than coins are, and thanks to coins we can date them quite precisely and identify the subjects. And finally we arrive to the functional relationships. So towards in the early 1st century BC we observe among the Roman political leaders that they used to put on their own seals very specific subjects, like in case of Sulla. It was his triumph over Jugurtha, and his second seal represented 3 trophies that stood for his victories on 3 continents. And the actual seals didn't survive, but we know how they more or less how they look like thanks to the coins, of course, because these images were recreated a little bit later by the son of Sulla. In case of Pompey the Great, he used to have a seal with 3 trophies that represented his triumphs on 3 continents as well. But in his case, he also used to seal, especially for the Eastern Mediterranean territory, he used a seal with lion holding a sword. Which was a reflection of a seal that Alexander the Great used to use. So we observe imitatio and Alexandri in his case, and thanks to the coins we can recreate these images and visualize how they look like. In case of Julius Caesar, he used a seal with Venus Vitrix that is represented in his coinage too. But it is important to remember that gems were really private sphere. And this is why on this intaglio, now in Bibliothèque Nationale in France, but found in Egypt, we find a portrait of Julius Caesar crowned with a laurel wreath, but there is also a sort of floral diadem over here, an image which would be not accepted in Rome, but in the Eastern Mediterranean it was perfectly okay, because people used to these royal symbols due to the Ptolemies and Seleucids and other dynasties. So glyptics actually offered much more in terms of advertisement rather than coins sometimes. And here's another interesting example, the cameo from the content collection, but it was found in Tarragona. Tarragona was elevated to the Roman colony in 45 BC by Julius Caesar himself. And we may wonder whether this piece was given to a sort of representative of local authority on the commission of Julius Caesar, or the person who from Tarragona actually commissioned something that would represent his patron, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is represented here with Venus, his divine patroness, quite directly, and we find the same reference on his coins as I said before. We observe in terms of gems and coins relationships, functional relationships, we observe that the same propaganda functions works in both media. Here we have an example of denarius minted by Sextus Pompey and Nasidius when they arrived to Sicily, and of course the point was to transfer authority of father of Sextus, Pompey the Great, on the son, and with this authority also came reference to Neptune, the god Neptune, and we observe the same pattern in action in case of gems, which represent the same phenomena. We can also observe on gems references to. Thanks to the coins, we can identify them, of course, in the first place. But we can see again that gems sometimes allowed to do more. Like here we have Octavian, and here is the star referring to the comet that appeared after Julius Caesar's funeral. And here is a bunch of examples of how diverse this iconography referring to Octavian was. And in terms of glyptics, he was really successful in terms of self-advertisement. There are many examples of gems usually made of glass, cheap glass, that were later on passed to his followers so that they could manifest loyalty and to their patron. But in case of Octavian, we also hear that his seal represented a sphinx, and we find very same sphinx in his coinage as well. And finally, his final seal bore a portrait carved by Dioscurides, who was the leader of a great imperial workshop established by Augustus himself. We can see that the actual image appearing on gems is very strikingly close to that one from a coin, so the image of emperor became a sort of state symbol. And speaking about the imperial code workshop, so we observe that, like in case of coins, gems started to be produced, not all of them of course, right, but many gems started to be produced in the imperial code workshop. Some of them were the best showpieces used by the imperial family itself, but there were others like this. This is another example of beautiful imperial eagle cameo from Vienna that basically functions in the same way as the aureus of Augustus, commemorating his title of receivement of his title of Augustus in 27 BC. But you can see that actually in the times of Augustus there are many other subjects that appears on both gems and coins alike, and these two media are really, really close. And even promotion of Julio-Claudian family is represented in both gems and coins, like we can see on this example. So to conclude all of this, As far as technical aspects are concerned, it is difficult to prove that gem engravers actually work as coin die makers at the same time. This does not mean, of course, they were no artists performing both professions. There is a clear gap in the research on this issue, and we should investigate it deeper. Work in both media, of course, is imaginable, as we could see in this presentation. But due to multiple explanations for gems iconography, it is rather difficult to state that the content was similar to that known from coins. However, some firm examples where substantial similarities in both media actually exist, meaning that further research should multiply these examples. And gems essentially share a lot with coins if it goes to their functions as propaganda means and self-presentation. And this is especially clear when the Roman Republic is concerned, and of course times of Augustus' reign. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And here I decided to put a sort of selection of literature if anybody is interested into gems after this presentation. So I recommend to choose one of these books or whatever, right? But there I just selected, one for the specific period. So so I limited myself really. But you're encouraged to read all of them quite easily. So thank you very much for your attention.
So I'm sure